In this study, we're going to begin our analysis of the epistolary greeting found in Revelation 1, 4, and 5a. And the passage reads, John, to the 7 churches that are in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you from he who is, and who was, and who is still to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from among the dead, the ruler over the kings of the earth. And these verses are an ancient epistolary greeting. They contain the 3 elements of a customary epistolary opening: the identification of the writer, John, the recipients, the 7 churches, and a greeting of blessing. And this greeting or salutation consists of 2 elements: the grace and peace greeting and the identity of the source of grace and peace. And as we've mentioned before, the book of Revelation is apocalyptic prophecy in an epistolary framework. And right here is where we get the epistolary framework kicking in. So first up is the writer of the epistle, and he's identified as John. And I did an introductory study in which we discussed all the issues of authorship, and my conclusion is that I believe that the John in question is the apostle. But if you have not listened to the introductory episode where we dealt with that in detail, you can go check that out for all of the reasons why I believe it to be John the apostle, as well as a discussion of why a lot of scholars believe that it is not John the apostle. The recipients of the letter are identified as the 7 churches, and these 7 churches are literal historic churches, but they also represent the universal church. The number 7 represents completion or fullness, so the fact that there are 7 churches addressed is no accident, and is how we know the letters are intended for the church universal through the ages. And this recognition of the universal scope of the book was understood very early. There's a quote from the Muratorian canon around 180 AD, which reads, quote, John, too, in the Apocalypse, though he writes to 7 churches, yet speaks to all, end quote. And Revelation itself confirms this interpretation of universality. Each of the 7 letters to the 7 churches contains the statement, anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he is saying to the churches. So right there we see anyone with ears to hear. That's a universal statement. And also that each of them is addressed to the churches, plural. So the 7 churches, again, represent the universal church. And these churches here, the historical churches, are in Asia, which is the Roman province and modern-day Western Turkey. Now, interestingly, the church fathers who were commenting on the book of Revelation in the 5th and 6th centuries viewed Asia in a mystical sense. And that's not really surprising, as the early church generally did a lot of mystical interpretation, which I personally like and enjoy that. But I wasn't expecting to notice it here. And they get this mystical understanding because they analyze the meaning of the word Asia, which they say meant elevated. And then depending on which of the church fathers you're consulting, you're reading, the interpretation of Asia as elevated either means or represents the advancing church, that's one option that they put forward, or the human race out of which believers are elevated. So when it says that, when John says that he's writing to the 7 churches who are in the province of Asia, the mystical interpretation of that would be that the believers are represented again by the churches, and they are in the province of Asia, but they're the elevated ones, those who are elevated out of or among the human race. So I personally don't really think that's what's intended by John, but I thought it was interesting, again, just to see how the early church is interpreting things. And one of my goals, one of the things I'm planning on doing, is just bringing in to our study some of the views of the early church, just so we can interact with those views and see what they thought and were teaching at the time. So that's what they thought that Asia represented. But now we come to the standard grace and peace. Now this is a little bit different than the standard Hellenistic salutation. The standard Hellenistic salutation was the Greek word chairein, which means greetings. And we see this in Acts 15:23 and Acts 23:26, as well as James 1:1. So instead of grace and peace, the Greek world would just say greetings. But Christian writers typically modified the salutation from greetings to grace. And grace and peace are typical elements in New Testament epistolary greetings. This combination is found in the epistles of Paul, Peter, and 2 John. Now, an interesting thing that I noticed was that Nebuchadnezzar's epistle, that's right, Nebuchadnezzar's epistle, which is found in Daniel chapter 4, begins as follows, quote, "King Nebuchadnezzar sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you," end quote. And then he obviously continues with the epistle. But notice there that he offers peace, but no grace. This grace and peace salutation is distinctively Christian. It's again a combination of the Greek word charis, which means grace, and the Hebrew shalom, which is peace. But in the New Testament, peace goes even deeper than its Old Testament Jewish counterpart. As Robert Thomas says, quote, "Because of Christ's death and the fulfillment of the Old Testament anticipations accomplished thereby, a person can experience and know he has peace with God through Jesus Christ. A peace resulting from the grace of God and the ultimate peace that a person can enjoy. Such a completed meaning lies behind the Christian use of the word," end quote. And Thomas Schreiner says similar. He says, quote, "We should also note that the order of the words grace and peace is important. In the New Testament, the order never varies. Grace always precedes peace, demonstrating that peace is the result of grace," end quote. So when we saw Nebuchadnezzar, he's wishing the people peace and prosperity, but he doesn't offer them grace. So what Thomas and Schreiner and others note is that without the grace of God, we're not going to have peace with God. And that's a New Testament thing that we have because of Christ. Again, as Thomas said, because of Christ's death and the fulfillment of the Old Testament anticipations or the prophecies that were completed in Christ's death and resurrection, we can now experience and know peace with God through Christ. Romans 5:1 would be another verse to look at in that context. And as Bruce Metzger notes, quote, "It is because of God's grace that his people can enjoy peace," end quote. So that's really what I want to talk about. This study I knew was going to be a little bit shorter than the others, or potentially quite a bit shorter, but I just wanted to spend this shorter study analyzing this epistolary framework and the pieces that go together to make it what it is, what the epistolary framework that the book of Revelation is crafted within. So in our next study, we will be discussing the he who is, who was, and who is still to come. What does that phrase mean? Who is that? Obviously God, but we'll analyze it in terms of the Old Testament. We'll do some Targum analysis, and that study will be quite a bit longer than this one. So thank you for joining me. If you're not subscribed, please do that. It helps the channel. If you are subscribed, be sure to like, share, comment, all that good stuff. It does help the analytics. It helps promote the channel, that YouTube will send it out more when there's more interaction. So thank you all for listening. God bless, and I'll talk to you very soon.